So we're going to officially get started. And I'd like to start by saying hello to everyone who is here either as a panelist or as an audience member. Thank you all for joining us this evening for Tefra ICA's Art School and Career Panel Series. This is the second discussion panel of the series this year. And tonight's program will focus on art history, art education, and art management. If you're interested in viewing the first program of the series, which focused on fine art practices, please visit Tefra ICA's website and select the Programs tab. Our three panelists, who I will introduce momentarily, will answer a series of questions about degree requirements, provide tips on pursuing a career in their respective fields, and share with the audience their personal experiences. After the panel discussion, we will open it up to a Q&A session with those in the audience. And before I introduce our panelists, I have a few notes. Upon entering the Zoom meeting, you will all have been muted. We kindly request that you keep your microphones off during the program to help us facilitate a clear discussion between the panelists. Although your audios will be off, we would still love to see you. If you have a camera and you're comfortable with this option, we encourage you to keep your videos on. During the presentation, we encourage you to type any questions you may have for the speakers into the chat feature. At the end of the talk, we will open it up for Q&A by reading those questions submitted. During the Q&A, you can also use the raise hand feature, and I can call on you to unmute yourself and ask your questions directly. Last but not least, this event will be recorded. If you would not like to be included in the recording but wish to listen to the talk, simply keep your microphone and camera turned off for the duration of the event. And before I introduce the panelists, I just wanted to call attention to Janelle, who very helpfully prompted us to all introduce ourselves in the chat box by introducing yourself with your name, pronoun, and what brings you here today. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, I don't think we'll be able to go over all of these responses verbally, but I still think it'd be nice for us to get to know each other a little bit and also to tell the panelists a little bit about what you're looking to get out of this event. So now I will introduce our panelists for the evening. First and foremost, we have Justin Sutters. Dr. Sutters is a K-12 art educator in an urban school district before attaining his doctorate degree from Ohio State University. He currently serves as the director of the Master of Arts in Teaching program in art education at George Mason University. He's published in numerous peer-reviewed journals and has presented his research at the state, national, and international levels. He served as the chair of the Professional Learning Through Research Working Group and the National Art Education Association Research Commission. And he also served on the review board of art education and visual arts research and has been a contributing member of the Data Visualization Working Group. He teaches numerous courses in the MAT program, is the advisor for the NAE student chapter, and mentors students on their research capstone. Second of all, we have Malik Glee. Malik is a writer, cultural worker, and curator based in Washington, D.C. Malik is the inaugural director of Stable, a facility for arts studio and programming. Before joining Stable, he has held positions for the Studio Museum in Harlem, Prince George's African American Museum, and has produced exhibitions and programming with the Museum of Contemporary African Diaspora and Arts, No Longer Empty, DNA Works, Red Bull Arts, Sugarcane Magazine, 10th Zine, John F. Kennedy Center, and more. He is adjunct professor at Bowie State University and has guest lectured internationally on Black contemporary art and vernacular cultures. Last but certainly not least, we have Molly Warnock. Molly is an art historian and critic based in Baltimore, the author of Simone Antayi and the Reserves of Painting, as well as a prior book in French on the same artist. Is it an artist?
Yes.
Yes. She has also published widely on aspects of modern and contemporary art in journals including Art Forum, Art in America, the Journal of the Pompidou Center, Tate Papers, Journal of Contemporary Painting, and nonsci.org. She holds a PhD in intellectual history and history of art from Johns Hopkins University and is the recipient of fellowship from the Mellon Foundation, the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, the American Council for Learned Societies, the Clark Art Institute, and the Nomis Foundation, among other institutions. In March of 2021, she joined the board of directors of Tefra Institute of Contemporary Art. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to our panelists. Molly, Malik, and Justin, are we ready to delve into our discussion for today?
Ready.
Yes.
Awesome. So to kick this off, let me ask you guys, what does a typical day at work look like for you? Should I call on folks?
I can begin. I think I may be unique in that I am a team of one. So I am at a very young nonprofit organization that opened its doors in 2019, right before pandemic. And we are a mid-development of human resource capacity across the board. And so as a team of one, my day can change forms, every single day. But when I'm on site, I am there with 19 working full-time artists who occupy studio space. So a lot of my day are facilitating tours with colleges and universities, curators, collectors, doing some professional development and strategic introductions for the artists at Stable, as well as interfacing with other partners. So I'm doing a lot of meetings on Zoom, a lot of Zoom fatigue, but my days look different every single day. I like this question because right now I'm reading a book, Atomic Habits, and I'm thinking about, how I can structure my day a little bit better. But right now, every day is quite unique.
I can jump in. I am also in some ways a team of one. So I work as a freelance writer and also editor. And I would say, again, as with Malik, I think it's fair to say that every day is a little bit different. But to generalize, I have at-home days when I'm mostly doing research and writing. And on those days, I try to do my intellectual heavy lifting, first drafting, things like this as early in the day as possible, because this is when I'm sharpest. And then in the afternoons, I'm generally working on more editorial projects, whether that means revising my own writing or editing other people's texts. But I also have a lot of away days when I'm doing studio visits, going to galleries, going to museums, trying to get myself physically in front of as much art as possible.
Great. Well, I guess in my current position, because I'm more in admin than I have been historically, so it's a little different than when I was a K-12 teacher, which was pretty much dictated by the school day. And that was very structured, and I sort of thrived in that environment. And now mine's not as structured. So I have a lot of autonomy, which is really wonderful. But it's also, a lot more expectations. So, some very, very long days at times, a lot of meetings, a lot of Zoom meetings. I sit on a lot of committees. Sometimes I go out to schools and visit K-12 schools, which I've been doing a lot recently. And then I do a lot of mentoring. I do teach classes and work with my graduate students. I do a lot of advising, and now I'm an assistant dean as well. So I'm just in a lot more admin meetings, unfortunately. So a lot of time behind the computer, more than I would like to be honest.
Yeah, thank you everyone so much for that. And I know this is our first question, but we're gonna go a little off course already. I'm hearing this theme of not really knowing what your day is going to look like and having all of these flexibility. How do you have any sort of advice or words of wisdom in terms of like how to navigate that, how to navigate having such different quote unquote job functions defined really loosely in your life as a professional?
For me, deadlines are incredibly important. This is not a novel or revolutionary thing to say, but because I do have a lot of autonomy over my own time, I need to have a pretty clear work plan that still allows for a certain amount of flexibility. So a lot of it is just sort of looking at the different projects that I'm working on, because at any given point I might be juggling 4 or 5 or more separate projects. between essays that need to be written, texts or collections of texts that need to be edited. And a lot of it is just sort of a numbers game, figuring out what a reasonable amount of time for that project is, penciling it in. And then a lot of those things get pushed around, but having some sort of work plan that can be adjusted.
I guess I don't know if it's post-pandemic or if it's just academia, but I've been feeling an increased pressure for everyone to sort of have your calendars be public. And I've been struggling with that, to be honest. I'm actually a very organized person. I love my calendar, but I also struggle with this sort of what it implies about having to be busy. And so I've been trying to sort of push back on that in a little way, knowing that I'm still like incredibly busy, but still finding ways to allow for engagement and just, walking around. I think something I've noticed since we're back on campus and, that those subtle moments where you sort of meet somebody in the hall or something happens serendipitously. I think we have to allow for that. So sometimes I really, like even today, I just forced myself a couple of times to get out from behind my computer, walk around the building, and just had some really incredible conversations. And so I think for me, it's just physically being present and having, making time for that, not feeling guilty about that, like not being goaded into every minute of your day being scheduled, which I think is a problem in our current society.
100%. Malik, do you feel compelled to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I'll start with the question firstly, and then piggyback on something that Justin said. So while every day looks different, I do maybe at Sundays or Monday mornings try to at least structure what are the deadlines for each individual day. And as of recent, a little bit more realistic about what I can accomplish in a day. And I think that goes to Justin's point. If I'm jam-packed and being a little bit too advantageous, then I miss the opportunity to relationship build and like have coffee extend another 10, 15, 20 minutes. And, as we're talking about our professional life in this field, relationships are everything. And I felt it was a disservice to the relationships I was cultivating by being so rigid on my calendar. So I just wanted to highlight and echo that adding some cushion into your day. I mean, the time is going to absorb itself, but adding some cushion is a benefit in ways that you cannot even, predict.
Yeah, absolutely. I really resonated with what you said about like those felt relationships are everything. Because
I recommend a great book real quick. I'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
A book that helped me through the pandemic. How to Do Nothing by Jenny Odell. She's an artist, and it's sort of like against the economy of the pushing back on this idea of social media and going out in nature and walking. It's a really, really beautiful book if you get the chance.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Justin. And now moving on to our second question. How did you decide to pursue the career path that you're on now? Or would you identify as someone who maybe like more stumbled onto this?
Definitely the latter. I see everyone's head shaking, but I would say definitely the latter. I don't think I chose, I didn't say I didn't choose. Everything is quite conscious and intentional, but stumbled into this particular career path. I'm a theater kid. My undergrad was in theater. I didn't, even my graduate degree is adjacent to the arts and anthropology. So nothing is quite linear in my life. But as I try to think of the through line, I think I'm always curious around the transmission and adaptation of living cultures. And so I think that could look like a theater performance in literary arts, that could look like a piece of contemporary art, that could look like a myriad of things. So I think at the seat of my interest has always been around cultural formations and sustainability. And it has taken very different paths, but I hope I'm answering the question. I'm trying to recall the question. How did I know? I grew up in I grew up with parents who were pseudo artists. They all pursued their very sustainable, viable professions. And as such, totally encouraged their children to become artists. And so really privilege and give a thanks to my parents for, really pushing me in my direction.
Awesome.
I can jump in, or if Justin would like to,
Oh, go for it.
would like,
Go for it.
okay. I mean, yeah, I would probably also use some different words. I mean, happenstance, but also inertia, maybe. And I would say the happenstance comes in because, you know, I really took my first art history class on a complete whim. I sort of liked the sound of it in the course catalog. You know, I didn't come from a city that was known for its art scene, or a family that especially went to museums. And so nothing had sort of primed me to be interested in art history. But I loved that first class. And then that led to other classes in art history. And then, you know, it started to feel like, well, I should go to graduate school. And as it happened, you know, I was in a PhD program at a time, or maybe just at a place, where as grad students, this was the early 2000s, there was a kind of default assumption that every graduate student was a professor in training, that we were all going to continue in academia. And so I did, you know, so I had a sort of first career, about 15 years teaching as a college professor. And academia can obviously be the right career path for some, but as it turns out, it wasn't actually the right career path for me. And so it, you know, certain decisions sort of carried me along. And then we got to a point where, you know, I really wanted, among other things, I really wanted a lot more control over my own time, which is what being a freelancer gives me. But I should also say that I was able to make that transition in part because I had, you know, this sustained period in academia that allowed me to build lots of connections and lots of relationships, both within academia, but also importantly, outside academia. So, you know, I already had strong relationships with certain journals, with certain museums, with, you know, particular editors, with individuals. And that network of people allowed me to set out on a different path because they sent opportunities my way. They immediately proposed collaborations. You know, so it was for me, it was kind of a winding path.
Well said. Yeah, I mean, mine was sort of happenstance in the sense of where I was geographically located. Was just incredibly fortunate, but also just I was a late bloomer, so it took me a while to come to. I was admittedly not the best student in high school. And so I went to community college for a year just because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And my parents said, you know, you're going to community financially. I really didn't have any other options. And it's just one of those weird situations that, you know, the counselor was like, well, what do you like to do? And I'm like, well, I'm pretty good at art. And I'm really, you know, I like working with kids. And so I took a painting class and a drawing class, and then I took an education course. And when I was in the education course, we had to go out and observe a teacher. And he's like, well, what kind of teacher do you want to observe? And he's like, math. And I'm like, no, social studies, no. And he's like, well, what other class? He's like, I'm taking an art class. He goes, well, why don't you go observe an art teacher? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, you can go to college to be an art teacher. And I was like, and it was like this moment, like, what do you, and I just happened to, I mean, 40 minutes away from where I grew up was one of the best art education schools in the country. It was a cheap state school that I could afford. So I didn't even apply anywhere else. I applied to that school, went, and just was really fortunate to have incredible professors. And then I ended up teaching in an inner city school, which for me was life-changing because I grew up in a very homogenous white suburb. And for me, teaching in this really diverse setting, just it changed me. Like it drastically challenged me in so many ways. And so as a result of that, that really informed my research. I went back to grad school. And so things I'm continually interested in is why our teaching population is incredibly homogenous when our student population is becoming increasingly diverse. So that sort of geared me into my graduate studies, where I eventually went back for my PhD. And that's sort of what my research has been about since, and training teachers to teach in this current moment, you know, of so many different things. So, yeah.
And since we're in this sort of nostalgic mood already, into great question. which is looking back at the early stages of your career, and perhaps this means your first career that's different from what you're doing now. What were some things that you did that felt beneficial and important, that had a lasting good impact, and what were some things you could have done differently?
Hmm. Well, I can jump in because it's sort of the tail end of that story. I'll just continue it. So again, I grew up in a pretty suburban area, and never really got to travel much growing up, besides like Philadelphia and some surrounding counties. And when I finished up my undergrad, I had the opportunity to go overseas, and I did my student teaching in England. And so for me, that was just a real, again, a game changer in terms of just seeing another culture. But then the irony was, I felt that England was more comfortable for me than the inner city school I was teaching at, 40 minutes from where I grew up. So I had this real sort of like disjunctive experience. And then after undergrad, I became an intern at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I taught summer programming for children inner city schools, and they brought students in for tours, and it was just amazing. And again, I just kept having these really incredible experiences where I just saw these transformative opportunities for students who might not have access to these type of spaces or experiences, and realizing what I grew up with and the access and opportunities I did. And so those were just really admittedly hard experiences for me to sort of process through them, but those are the ones I always look back at as really transformative and sort of benchmark experiences in my not only personal development, but really my professional development.
I could jump in here, perhaps. I mean, I would say that one of the big through lines in all the work that I've been doing for some 20 years now is that what I enjoy most is engaging with artists. I like being in the studio. I like seeing how things actually get made. I like hearing what artists are thinking about. I like the back and forth of conversation. And so in retrospect, I think that probably one of the most consequential decisions that I made, although I didn't understand it in these terms at the time, was to write a dissertation on a living artist. When I began working on my dissertation, the subject, a Hungarian-born painter named Simon Antai, who was living in Paris, was in his 80s. And I got fellowships early on that allowed me to spend 2 full years in Paris. And when I first arrived, I thought, I'm going to be in the library a lot. I'm, mostly going to be sort of looking in the reserves of various museums. And I did end up doing those things. But I also, from the very beginning, was presented with the possibility of meeting the subject of my dissertation, who also coincidentally turned out to live about a 2-minute walk from my student housing at the École Normale Supérieure, which was amazing. And then it felt like I needed to meet him. But had I been left to my own devices, I think I would have waited a very long time to meet him, because I would have been waiting until I felt ready, whatever that would have meant. And then I would, in fact, have lost a lot of incredibly valuable time that we spent talking together and looking at work and things of this sort. And so the lesson that I draw from that is that when you're thinking about projects you might take on, when you're thinking about artists that particularly draw you, at the very beginning of a relationship, it's often more important to be open and inquisitive and intellectually curious than to have read every existing source on that particular artist or topic, although you should later do those things as the relationship develops, particularly if you want to publish. But I think just that it is often important for me to leap before I feel ready, because readiness, some ideal readiness, might never come, and you can waste a lot of time waiting for that state of ideal preparedness.
I like that.
I do too. And I think that's something I needed to hear today, Molly. So thank you. But also that may help me think a little bit more about this question, in that something that I decided to do early on that really set the tone of my career was very, very young, almost unconventionally. So in my early 20s, I was the executive director of a small museum, the Prince George's African American Museum. And when I was approached, I did not apply for this role. I was having another role in the institution and was approached by the then ED to take this on. And I was a little taken aback because I'm like, well, what skill set do you see? I don't see what you see. But the fact that someone who I trusted and believed in and who mentored me saw something within myself when I even had a little bit of trepidation and insecurity really gave me, as Molly said, like the chutzpah to go without being prepared in my own mind. And so that really set me on a great course of action. The next example that was firstly on my mind was when I was at the Studio Museum in Harlem. I was there in institutional planning, so working in a non-curatorial capacity, but via my personality, just, having small talk during lunch, getting to know the curators, they helped that part of my interest and that part of what would be the more primary aspect of my career to date, making sure that I knew about residency and fellowship opportunities, writing the letters of recommendation. All of that came from, sharing even if that's not the title you have, being confident in your interests, like being confident where the way you want your life to go and allowing others to support you and move you in that direction.
Yeah, I love that. I'm hearing a through line of like really embracing some kind of discomfort and embracing some kind of unknown, and trust in your own capacity to sort of like live up to a challenge that you've set for yourself, or be able to take risks in a healthy way and come out the other side being better for that. Yeah, I really love that we're sort of like landing on this theme, and I feel like that's a really important thing perhaps for folks that are either in college right now or just graduating to hear. And while we're
As something came to mind too, which has been a very important relationship in my professional life. I'll also say for those who are listening, to offer your flowers to persons if you're following their work. If you like someone's scholarship, I have a beautiful relationship with cultural critic writer Natalie Hopkinson, and it started on Twitter. I just DM'd her like, oh my God, I love your book. And now we're co-curating an exhibition for, a museum that's breaking ground. So, that tweet has, several years down the line, produced a very fruitful relationship. So I just wanted to I don't know how that came to my mind, but I wanted to highlight, if there's persons in this room that you have some follow-up questions for, it feels good to be on that receiving end. And so likely you'll see that conversation, roll out just as you would like it to.
Yeah. And I'd like to, because I think I really like what Molly said about the discomfort. But as I was saying before, I did grow up I'm born and raised pretty much same area my whole life. And looking back, it was a pretty insular upbringing, really wonderful. I was very fortunate. But I feel like as I got older, the more I realized that, the more I had this sort of like impulse to get out and to experience other things. And so I just travel. Like I said, for me, at first foray was teaching in an inner city school, which was just for me so different from where I grew up. And then I started taking high school students on international service-based trips. Then I actually left my teaching position. I was a K-12 teacher, and I taught at a small international school in Brazil. And that was like a huge jump for me because I just left everything. I just lived out of a suitcase and no friends. Was never even in Brazil, just signed a contract to go live in Brazil for 2 years, didn't speak Portuguese. And, but I was going on these short-term trips, but, one of the things I think our topic here about the arts is, we study culture and we understand, we have these sort of curiosities about context and about why things are made and how different people in different places make things and understand the world. And so I kept going on these short-term trips, and they were like little teases. And I would just get there and I'd be like, oh, this is amazing. And then I'd have to go home. And so I just eventually was like, I need to like really live in another culture and get it like an extended understanding. I can't do this sort of tourist mentality. And so some of my research talks about this sort of tourist approach to sort of cultural understanding. And so I wanted like what, some would call a more authentic situation. And so I think that for me was sort of that big risk, but for me, it was at a big cost, I financially developing my career, relationally, so I think some things we have to sort of be willing to do is consider that cost, right? There's things we want to do, but are we willing? I don't, people would say to me, oh, I wanted to go live overseas. I'm like, yeah, but did you really? Were you really willing to do it? Like everybody says they want to, but you have to also be willing to pay the price for that at times. And so I think sometimes we just have to consider, if this is something we really want to do, do we think it's worth it in that sense? And what's our motivation for doing it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up, Justin. As we were talking, I was just thinking about, so we've been talking about taking these risks and these, let's call them healthy discomforts or healthy risk taking, right? And then on the other side of the spectrum is an unhealthy discomfort, or something that we should learn to say no to. I think as an emerging professional, there's often these situations that you're put into where you don't really know to say no to something, or that because you're so young, you're not saying no to anything. And that comes out to being in your disadvantage in the long run. So I'm still trying to like formulate a question, right, as I'm talking, but do y'all want to talk about perhaps like did you go through something along the lines of like, did you feel embarrassed to say no to something? Did you feel like you had to say yes to something? And then how to tell the difference between a healthy risk taking or a healthy pushing of your own boundaries versus something that you should hold strong to?
Question.
I can take this up in a very sort of general sense. Just since I've been talking about being in Paris as a young scholar, just starting out, I'll sort of keep us there for the moment. When I arrived and began working on Antai, one of the most difficult things for me was negotiating the personalities around the artist, because in fact, there was a very strong group of individuals who had been interested in and defending and promoting his work for a very long time, in some cases since the 60s or 70s. And these were all individuals, almost exclusively men, several generations older than myself, native French speakers, which obviously I was not, and individuals with immense institutional or at any rate cultural capital. And a number of these figures, I should say up front, were very helpful to me. They talked to me, they gave me their books, they gave me other contacts, they helped me get into collections. They really genuinely helped me in various aspects. But none of that was happening from a disinterested position, because these were also human beings. And so one of the things that I learned early on was that while everybody else might have a strong vision of what my project should do and whose sides it should take in various debates and what bodies of work it should privilege, I also happen to have a strong sense of what my project should do. And learning to trust my own authority and the strength and validity of my own arguments in a place where the power dynamic was completely asymmetrical, and often felt gendered too, and also had a kind of nationalistic dimension to it at the same time. Like, there were a lot of variables that needed to be balanced. But I think just the strength to actually pursue the argument I wanted to run while being buffeted by strong, compelling, competing visions, right? I think that is one of the hardest things for any emerging scholar, but also any emerging artist probably to do, right? Learning to actually trust in your own voice. And I don't know that I have any brilliant tips for how to do that. I think that that's something that comes to an experience, but being aware of that, right? Being aware that actually at a certain moment you can say, no, I don't want to run this argument that you're like selling me every time we have coffee, right? Like, I know what I think about these works, and that's what I'm going to write, and that's what I'm going to defend.
Hmm. So, yeah, I guess I would say, I remember when I was a first year teacher, I was teaching at a pretty rough school, and there was just a lot of, I hate to be stereotypical, but just sort of older teachers, and they were just, a lot of them were just sort of miserable people. And yeah, I mean, I felt bad because they were, they're working in a very challenging place for a long time. And thankfully, I had like a really amazing mentor teacher, and she gave me this advice like, just stay out of the faculty lounge, stay away from those people because they'll sort of drag you down. And so I sort of took that in a larger way of always, like, I've worked so many different types. I mean, I've worked in dozens of different schools. I've worked in 5 different states, been a lot of different programs. And you sort of learn quickly, like, who your people are, right? The people who are going to be positive, the people who are intellectually challenging you. And so I think in any field, there's a tendency for people to sort of like become static, and they just sort of get burnt out, and they're sort of like joy stealers, right? And they just will really sort of bring you down. And so one thing I've in every situation, you're always going to deal with difficult people. You can't avoid them completely, especially now that I'm in admin, I'm dealing with it more. But, I think part of me is just really, I think one of the other questions we ask about like a professional development, and for me, it's like my national organization, the National Art Education Association. And so we have state conferences and we have national conferences. And like whenever I go to them, I just come back feeling like energized and right and hopeful and optimistic and encouraged. And so I think we have to find those sort of people and other people that you have that same vision, same mission, that because otherwise it's very easy, if you're not careful, to fall into that sort of negative and stagnant and sort of it's hard. So I think it really requires a concerted effort to do that. And art people, I think, for the most part, are just really good people. So people always like, I'm again stereotypes, but I'm often reminded of that, because even in academia, I'm in meetings with people from like, and science, and I'm just like, but you know what? As challenging as artists can be, they're also just really cool people. They're fun people. They're engaging. They're always dynamic and doing so. At least, I always try to look at that and remember, like, but I get to work with really smart, talented, dynamic people, which I think for me is like super energizing.
Mm-hmm. Malik, do you have thoughts?
It's just come to me because I don't really have any yeses I necessarily regret, but a no's that I'm more confident in right now are one, they may be informed by COVID, but I do also think they're just informed by kind of my social bandwidth, and that this field is quite social. It's about developing relationships. It's about going to openings and studio visits and small talk. And for someone like myself, that can be quite exhaustive. But also for someone like myself who is having a truly packed 9 to 5, I'm not coming to an opening that's 6 to 9 quite fully present and there. And so I had to learn that I don't want to meet people not being my best self. So often that means saying no to what could be perceived as an ideal networking opportunity, but really saying yes to resting and, making sure that when I do have the opportunity to engage again, I'm not coming with bags under my eyes and, kind of regretting it, but I'm coming fully present. So I would say for emerging professionals, there is a perchance pressure to network, and be very busy and be very seen and be very out, which has totally its kind of social perks and those social professional capital perks, but also at the negotiation of what you need as an individual. And so that comes to mind as like a no that I'm more confident in right now.
Thank you so much. Give me 1 second. So I'm back. We got into this great conversation about these words of wisdoms, and sort of y'all's personal experiences, and I think those are super helpful. And I'd like to pivot us a little bit now to talk about some more concrete stuff. Could we talk a little bit about what the education requirements are for your areas of work? And piggybacking off of it, if there are specific internships, fellowships, apprenticeships that you would recommend to folks who are interested in eventually being in your position, potentially, or comparable position?
Yeah. Sure, I can go because mine's probably the most concrete in that it's pretty linear. My area is K-12 art education, so people who want to be public school art teachers. It's pretty specific based on state. So if you live in Virginia or Maryland, you have state requirements. So you go to a teacher education licensure program, which I direct at Mason. So students come. Mine's a graduate level program, so students often have an undergraduate already. They decide, I want to be an art teacher. And so we prepare them through coursework, through research, through fieldwork in the schools. And they eventually student teach, which is a semester long internship in a public school, 2 public schools, and then they receive state licensure. And then after that, many teachers continue with their professional development, either by going back for another master's. I have a master's in art education and printmaking. Some go the studio route, some go administration, and then some go to academia. So the terminal degree in my field is a PhD or a doctorate. So for those who want to pursue eventually a teaching position in academia, we have a position right now we're searching for, and they generally are active researchers. They have a teaching background, and so that is sort of the terminal outcome for those who desire to teach. So as I was out in a public school the other day, one of the little 3rd graders said to me, like, "What are you doing?" They're like, "You teach teachers?" And like the little 3rd grader couldn't get his head around that. He's like, "What do you mean you teach teachers?" Like they just assume teachers wake up and have all this knowledge, right? So it is. I mean, that's what I get to do, and it's amazing. I teach teachers, and I love it.
I'm struggling a little here because I think it's my path is quite wonky. I would say for someone who is a director of a nonprofit organization, depending on its mission, scope, and intents, the requirements could be, quite varied. But for a position comparable to myself, you're likely looking at a master's degree in arts administration, art history, something that is, again, an advanced degree related to contemporary artistic production and or the management, financial or otherwise, of a nonprofit organization, the governance of a nonprofit organization. I'm so sad that the one internship I want to highlight is now defunct, and that is no longer empty, based in Brooklyn, New York. They produce exhibitions in unconventional spaces. And so as someone who is managing and leading a startup organization in a refurbished warehouse, an unconventional space, that a lot of the learnings and experience from that program are coming to mind now. But that's a little bit about what may be required for a comparable position. Of course, I think it would vary depending on the scope, intents, and mission of the organization.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a little bit difficult for me to generalize just because my own path has been so circuitous in certain respects. I have a PhD in art history and intellectual history. I don't think that is at all obligatory if you want to be an arts writer and editor, but there are ways in which it is certainly advantageous. And one of these ways is that it simply increases the range of commissions that I can take on. There are various situations in which one would perhaps want to have a more conventional scholarly credential. I don't know that commercial galleries care about this so much, but a number of museums do. And I would also say that another area in which it's quite advantageous is that it means that I can apply for more traditional academic fellowships and grants. So for example, all of the last academic year, I was in residency at the University of Basel in Switzerland, and that was a position that required that I hold a PhD. That's also true of a number of other yeah, I mean, they're specifically characterized as postdoctoral fellowships. So it will increase certain opportunities for you. That said, if one is considering graduate study at all, I probably would suggest that it's better to pursue a PhD in a program that will fund you than an MA that you have to pay for and potentially go into debt for.
Yeah.
I think a lot of terminal MAs in art history really are not good value, and this is a serious consideration.
It's an interesting point. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a super important point. And I hate to cut us off right now, but somehow it is already 6:51. So thank y'all so much for your amazing advice. And I really do hope that our audience members found some of the stuff we went over today helpful. And at this time, I'd like to open it up to the audience to ask any questions that they may have. And I'm looking at the chat right now. It does not look like we have any questions in the chat box. The folks in the audience, we have quite an intimate audience today. So I think it'll be okay for whoever has a question to just unmute themselves and go ahead.
Hi, I wanted to ask concerning the last question that was answered, or the last statement that was made about MFA programs that will fund you. Do you have any more language around that? I'm really interested in going back to school to pursue a master's, and I wasn't. This is kind of I'm kind of ignorant to the fact that that is a possibility. So, do you have any more words to say about that?
I'm afraid I don't regarding MFA programs specifically.
I can speak to that, to MFA. If you, I mean, I want to cut you off, Mop, if you want to speak to your field.
No, go ahead, Justin.
Yeah. So I was the graduate director last year at Mason, but admittedly, our MFA program was struggling because of that reason, because of the fiscal support. Many universities provide funding. So like when I completed my PhD, my tuition was covered. I was a TA, I taught. And a lot of MFA programs are like that, but some of them are more, a lot of universities are moving towards a different model, like a 2-year intensive with summer intensives for working professionals. So it's really interesting. I've been keeping a real eye on this, and I feel like COVID has sort of accelerated that or changed this trajectory in sort of what graduate degrees look like, who's sort of the target audience for those programs. It's a lot more non-traditional students. So there's not like this sort of clear linear, go to undergrad, go right to MFA. You have a lot of people sort of coming back to it or who are working professionals. So in one way, I think, COVID and online courses has provided new entry points into these graduate programs. And even in Europe, which I wouldn't be surprised if the European model, many MFAs or terminal degrees in studio are actually going towards a PhD. And so there's some major sort of paradigm shifts in terminal degrees and what they look like. So I don't feel like it's as sort of cut and dried as to like what programs, 20, 25 years ago when I started. So I think there's a lot more options now. And because of that, programs have to be very market driven for how they appeal, because it's really competitive right now to get students. Actually, there's not as many students applying for MFA programs. And a lot of that is because there's not as many studio positions in universities. A large percentage of faculty positions are adjunct. So because of that, it's really changed the market. So to go back to your question, I think what you would need to do is just really talk to universities if you're going to go full time, what their support is. Can you be a TA? Can you be a graduate assistant, a teaching assistant? There's a lot of options there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brittany, for your question. I was muted. Sorry. I see that Janelle has a question in the chat box. Janelle says, thank you to each of the speakers who are here today. As you've mentioned in the conversation, navigating the arts field can be unpredictable in some cases. What would you say is one of the most challenging obstacles you've encountered in your career so far? And how did you navigate around/out of it?
Hmm.
I'm in one of the most challenging parts of my career at this moment, and I'm trying to make the response brief in that I joined an organization that needed some. My scope of work had increased from being a director of art and programming to being a director and or a executive director of the organization, also responsible for its financials and its sustainability and donorship, etc. And so for me, it became quite overwhelming. And the way that I am finding a solution to that problem is one, assembling a team around me that has a vested interest not only in the organization, but also has a vested interest in myself and my stewardship of the organization. And so I think that yeah, I'm in a very challenging position right now. And the primary thing is overwhelm and figuring out what are my priorities day by day, week by week, month by month, being quite strategic and not falling into what could be a standstill of just overwhelm. So I think putting, looking big picture and also filling out your particular strengths and weaknesses. And I think it could be comparable to not only, someone who is stewarding an organization forward, but if I'm writing an essay or if I am, I'm trying to give another example where they're just peers, persons who I can lean on for support. So I would say in thinking about the challenge I'm in and trying to make it a little unilateral and comparable to where everyone's sitting at, it's about, reaching out and asking for help. It's about being strategic and priority oriented. Um, yeah, that's the brief of it. That's how I can make it quick. Yeah.
Do you have something, Molly, or?
I I may abstain from this for fear of libeling former colleagues, but yeah, I mean, obstructionist personalities can be a real issue. And I think Malik and Justin, you've both touched on the theme of having to find the people that you can really trust, the people who are really your support network. And yeah, I will perhaps leave matters there. But yeah, finding your people is the absolute most important thing.
All right. So I'll be perfectly blunt. My biggest obstacle, this is my 25th year teaching, is just making a livable salary. It's being in education and in the arts specifically, it's just not a career that pays very well. And if you've been watching the news, that's why so many teachers are leaving the field, unfortunately. Historically, we just haven't kept up with inflation and with sort of standard living, which historically education has been a very staple of middle class living. It just isn't anymore. So for me, it's just how to continually do what you want to do, what you love to do, but sort of having side hustles. And I just got a lot of hustles. I've always just had things going on the side, 2-3 jobs. And so that's been hard, especially now. I'm married, I have 2 young kids. I'm getting older. I have to start thinking about putting money away. And this area, I live in Northern Virginia, which is very, very expensive. So that's just sort of like a constant stressor because, I know with my qualifications and skills, like I could probably go into another sector and make 2-3 times as much money as I'm making. But it's just one of those things where I love what I do. And so I'm just always trying to find ways to make it work. And so I've been, I think, pretty successful in that area. And admittedly, last thing, I've moved into admin mainly for that reason, because financially, when you're a professor, once you get tenured, it's not like another job where you can renegotiate your contracts. You're sort of stuck in a salary. So the only way you get raises is to move up in status. So I've just moved more into admin a lot, one altruistically, because I see my sphere of impact larger, but a lot of it is just to live a more comfortable and to take care of my family and things like that. So I think it's a real challenge. I mean, it's that narrative of like the arts and people don't make money. And I'm always having students say, well, why am I going to go to college for art? And so, it's something that I fight, I push back against, in that, if it's something you feel strongly about, there's ways to live a very good quality of life, but it is a challenge. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is challenging. And so you have to sort of be really strategic about how you navigate that.
Yeah. I remember during our last panel, one of our panelists, Maria, said something
My
like,
colleague.
yes, Maria from GMU, she said something like, if you want a normal career, why did you go to art school? And that I went to art school, and that feels like something that really resonated with me. This idea that you go into the arts field because that's something you're passionate about. And personally, I would say that if I get to make that decision again, I'd still go to art school. But yeah, coming out the other end. So thank you so much, Justin, for just this like openness and honesty about a lot of the financial challenges that's really real in this sector. So it is 7:02. And I just want to say thank you, Justin, Malik, and Molly, all of you, for joining us this evening as panelists. And Lindsay just said thank you. Thank you, Justin, for that honesty. Thank you all for the advice. Molly, I also appreciated the leap before you're fully ready advice.
I'm glad, Lindsay.
So thank you all for joining us today as panelists. I think you shared some really valuable insights with us. I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today as an audience member. I hope this discussion is helpful for you, either as you apply for a degree in the arts, or start your career, or continue your career. If you'd like to revisit anything we went over today, this program has been recorded, and it will be available on Tefra ICA's website soon as it's edited. We will be sending you all in the audience a post-program follow-up email as well, where we will include the recording of this event as well as some details on other upcoming public programs at Tefra ICA. We would really love to see some of you come back to Tefra. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Please stay connected with us on social media at Tefra ICA, and sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already done so that you can stay updated on future programs, exhibitions, and events. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.